Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. A few years ago, I started noticing things in my room that didn't make sense at first. Not loud things, not obvious things, just small, quiet moments that felt slightly off, like the room wasn't as empty as it should have been. It began with my ceiling. My room has one of those popcorn textured ceilings, the kind that looks random and messy, like frozen splashes of paint. I had lived under it for years without ever really paying attention to it. It was just there. But one night, lying in bed and staring up at it the way you do when you can't sleep, I noticed something strange. The texture didn't look random anymore. Certain shapes stood out, clearer than they should have. At first, I assumed it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the way clouds sometimes look like animals if you stare long enough. But this felt different. The shapes didn't fade when I blinked. They didn't shift when I looked away and back again. They stayed. I kept staring. Slowly, the shapes began to feel intentional. Lines seemed to connect. Curves formed where there hadn't been curves before. It wasn't like the ceiling physically changed, but it was as if my brain was being guided toward very specific patterns, ignoring everything else. I felt watched, not in a threatening way, more like observed, curious, patient. I didn't feel scared at first. That surprised me. If anything, I felt calm, almost comforted, like someone was sitting quietly nearby without needing to be seen. The shapes started forming things that looked like symbols, then letters. Not sharp or perfect, but close enough that I couldn't ignore them. I sat up in bed, heart beating faster, and whispered out loud, asking if I was imagining it. The shapes shifted again. That's when I realized it wasn't random at all. Over time, this became a pattern. Late at night, when the room was quiet and my mind wasn't distracted, the shapes would appear more clearly. They didn't come with sounds or movement, just a sense of presence and the ceiling responding in ways I couldn't explain. Eventually, words started forming. Not long sentences, short ones, names, simple messages, things that felt childlike in their simplicity. Nothing threatening, nothing dark, just communication. I didn't tell anyone at first. How do you even start that conversation without sounding unhinged? I tried to rationalize it. Pareidolia, stress, imagination. But none of those explanations fully fit, especially because I wasn't trying to see anything. It was happening on its own. One night I asked a question, not out loud at first, just in my head. Who are you? The shapes took longer that time. I remember holding my breath, staring up at the ceiling, my chest tight with anticipation. Then, slowly, letters formed. A name. It wasn't a name I recognized. It sounded old-fashioned, the kind of name you don't hear much anymore. Simple, soft, the kind of name you'd expect a little girl to have. I said it out loud. The room felt warmer after that. Not physically exactly, but emotionally, like acknowledgement mattered. From that point on, it felt less like something happening to me and more like something happening with me. I would ask questions, and the ceiling would respond in its own strange way. The answers were always simple, never complex, never detailed. Like talking to someone who didn't fully understand the world the way adults do. That's when the realization started to form. This didn't feel like a human ghost. It felt younger, smaller, less aware of death as a concept. It felt like an imaginary friend. That thought unsettled me more than the idea of a normal haunting. Imaginary friends are created by children. They're shaped by loneliness, imagination, and emotional need. They exist in that strange space between thought and belief. The idea that one could linger, even after the child who created it was gone, felt deeply wrong and deeply sad. Eventually, curiosity outweighed fear. I told my family what was happening. They were skeptical, of course, but they also knew me well enough to know I wasn't the type to make something like this up for attention. After a lot of discussion, someone suggested something that hadn't occurred to me. What if we contacted the old owners of the house? It took some effort, but we managed to track them down. The conversation was awkward at first. You can't exactly lead with, "Hey, is your house haunted by your kid's imaginary friend?" without expecting confusion. So we eased into it. We asked about the family who lived there before us, about their kids, about anything unusual. There was a pause. Then they mentioned their daughter. They said she used to talk to someone all the time, someone no one else could see. She would play alone in her room, having full conversations, laughing, getting upset, even comforting this unseen companion when she thought it was sad. They said she had given it a name. I asked what it was. It was the same name. The room felt very quiet after that. The old owners brushed it off the way most parents do. Imaginary friends are common. Kids grow out of them. Eventually, their daughter had stopped talking about it, and life moved on. They had never thought much of it again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. If this really was the same presence, then whatever was in my room wasn't the ghost of a child who died there. It was something else entirely. Something created, believed in so strongly that it somehow stayed. The idea made my skin prickle. After that confirmation, the presence felt more real, not stronger, but more defined, like it knew I knew now. The communication didn't change much. Still simple, still quiet, still gentle. Sometimes I'd lie in bed and feel like I wasn't alone, but not in a way that made me want to run. It felt friendly, familiar, like a shy companion sitting at the edge of the room, unsure if it was welcome but hopeful. That doesn't mean it wasn't unsettling. There were nights I questioned my sanity, nights I stared at the ceiling and saw nothing at all, wondering if the whole thing had been a coincidence layered on top of an overactive mind. But then, on nights when I wasn't expecting it, the shapes would return, clear, intentional. The scariest part wasn't the presence itself, it was the implications. If an imaginary friend could linger like this, what did that say about belief, about consciousness, about the way humans imprint parts of themselves onto the world without realizing it? This wasn't a violent haunting. There were no slamming doors or cold spots or whispered threats. Just quiet interaction, observation, existence. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering how long it had been alone before I noticed it. Years, decades? Had it been waiting? Or had it only existed again once someone was willing to see it? That thought made me sad. There's something deeply lonely about an imaginary friend outliving the imagination that created it. No longer needed, no longer acknowledged, just present. I don't know if it understands what happened to the girl who imagined it. I don't know if it understands that time passed, that houses change hands, that people grow up and forget the things that once felt real to them. All I know is that it's there, still. My room doesn't feel dangerous. If anything, it feels watched over in a strange, childish way, like the presence doesn't know how to be anything else except what it was made to be. Sometimes I joke about it. I say my room is haunted, but in a sweet way, a harmless way, and maybe that's true. But late at night, when the ceiling feels just a little too intentional, and the air feels just a little too aware, I stop joking. Because whether it's a ghost, a leftover imprint, or something we don't have a name for, it reminds me of how thin the line is between imagination and reality, how belief can shape things in ways we don't fully understand, and how some things, once created, don't disappear just because we stop believing in them. So, yeah, my room is somewhat haunted, sweet, but also not something I take lightly anymore. When my brothers tell this story, they always start by saying, "It was just a game. Hide and seek. Something kids have played a million times before without anything going wrong." And that's true. On the surface, nothing about that night should have been memorable at all. But there are moments that don't feel scary while they're happening, only strange. And then there are moments that grow heavier with time, the longer you sit with them. This was in one of our old houses, a place we don't talk about much anymore. It wasn't especially old or run down, just a normal house in a normal neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed like it could happen. But looking back, there was always something about it that felt off in subtle ways. Not enough to make you scared, just enough to make you uneasy if you paid attention. That night, my two brothers were bored. It was late enough that the house was quiet, but not so late that anyone was asleep yet. They decided to play hide and seek, and for whatever reason, they made it harder by turning all the lights off. No lamps, no hallway light, nothing. Just the faint glow from outside coming through the windows. At first, it was fun. They laughed, whispered, tried not to bump into furniture as they moved through the dark. The house sounded different without the lights on. Every step echoed a little more. Every small noise felt louder. One of my brothers went to hide. The other started counting, facing the wall like you're supposed to. When he finished, he began searching room by room, feeling his way through the house instead of relying on sight. Doors creaked softly as he opened them. Closets, corners, behind furniture, all the usual hiding spots. Then he reached one of the bedrooms. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The room was pitch black. No moonlight, no streetlight, just darkness. He stood there for a moment listening, trying to catch any sign of movement or breathing. That's when he heard it. Breathing, not his own, not the soft sound you make without realizing it. This was clear, slow, steady, coming from inside the closet. At first, he felt a rush of excitement, that familiar thrill of thinking you've found the person you're looking for. He smiled in the dark and quietly walked closer to the closet door. The breathing didn't stop. It didn't speed up or change like someone trying to stay quiet. It just continued. He stood right in front of the closet and whispered my brother's name, teasing him, expecting a laugh or some kind of reaction. There was none, but the breathing was still there, close enough that he could tell exactly where it was coming from. The closet door was slightly open. He reached out his hand. His fingers brushed against nothing but the wall. At first, he assumed he just missed. Closets are cramped, especially in the dark. He reached in again, feeling around more carefully this time. The back wall, the sides, the floor, empty. The breathing was still there. That's when the excitement turned into something else. Confusion first, then fear. He pulled his hand back and stood frozen, his heart starting to race. His mind tried to catch up, running through explanations as fast as it could. Maybe it was an echo, maybe it was his own breathing and he just didn't realize it. Maybe my brother had slipped past him somehow. He leaned in one more time, stretching his arm all the way into the closet, pressing his hand against every surface he could reach. No one was there. And then the breathing stopped. Not gradually, not fading away. It just stopped. That was enough. He didn't check the rest of the room. He didn't call out again. He turned and ran out of the bedroom as fast as he could, nearly tripping over himself in the dark. He didn't even stop to turn the lights on. He just ran until he found my other brother, who had come out of hiding by then. When he told him what happened, they both laughed at first. Nervous laughter, the kind you use when something doesn't make sense and you don't want to admit that it scared you. They tried to convince themselves it was nothing. Maybe air moving through the house, maybe imagination, maybe nerves. But neither of them could explain one thing. Whose breathing was it? They checked the closet together with the lights on. Empty. No vents inside. No animals. No explanation. The walls were solid. There was nowhere for a person to hide without being felt. And yet, someone had been breathing there. That night didn't end in screaming or crying. They didn't run to tell anyone immediately. They just stopped playing and stayed close to each other for the rest of the evening. The game was over. Over time, the story became something they'd mention occasionally, usually as a joke. Remember that time you heard breathing in the closet? But every time it came up, the mood shifted just a little. There was always an unspoken understanding that something about it wasn't funny. We moved not long after that. Officially, the move had nothing to do with the house itself. New opportunities, new reasons, things that make sense on paper. And we've always said the breathing probably wasn't related. But it's hard not to connect those dots when you look back. That house had other moments like that. Nothing dramatic enough to point to and say, that's proof. Just little things. Sounds that didn't have a clear source. The feeling of being watched when no one was around. The way some rooms felt colder or heavier than others. The breathing in the closet was the clearest moment, though. The one that couldn't be brushed off as easily. Because it wasn't a shadow or a shape or something half seen out of the corner of an eye. It was a sound. A human sound. One that implied presence, proximity, awareness. Someone was close enough to be heard, and yet no one was there. Even now, years later, we still don't know what it was. We joke about it being a ghost, because joking is easier than sitting with the alternative. That something shared that space with us, even briefly, and chose not to reveal itself fully. Sometimes I think about that moment from the perspective of whatever made the sound. If it was something at all? Was it aware it was being heard? Did it stop breathing because it realized it had been noticed? Or was the silence just coincidence? The scariest part isn't the idea of a ghost. It's the idea of something being there, close enough to breathe, and then choosing not to be there anymore, or choosing not to be heard. We don't live in that house now. We never went back. Life moved on the way it always does. But that story stayed. It comes up every once in a while, usually late at night, usually when the lights are low. And every time it does, there's a pause afterward, because no matter how much time passes, none of us have ever found an explanation that feels right. And that breathing still doesn't have a name. When I worked at a lumber yard several years ago, I learned very quickly that the place carried a different kind of danger than most people imagine. From the outside, it just looked like stacks of wood, forklifts, and big machines doing loud but predictable work. To someone who's never been inside a mill, it probably seemed rough but straightforward. What most people didn't realize was how thin the line was between an ordinary shift and something that could permanently ruin or end a life. Twice a year, like clockwork, the regional supervisor would come through. He was an older guy, calm, experienced, and not the type to exaggerate. When he showed up, everyone knew what was coming. We'd gather around, leaning on pallets or standing near the break area, and he would start telling stories, not rumors, not "I heard this once," real incidents. Accidents that had happened in mills just like ours, sometimes even in the same company. The point wasn't to scare us for entertainment. It was to make sure we understood why the safety rules existed, why we had lockout procedures, why certain machines required 2 people, why shortcuts were not tolerated. Those talks always left the place quieter afterward, less joking, less careless movement, at least for a while. One story in particular never left me. One of our mills had a plywood press. If you've never seen one in person, it's hard to fully grasp how massive it is. It's not a fast-moving machine like a saw blade that you instinctively know to stay away from. It's slow, heavy, deliberate, almost calm. That's what makes it dangerous. The process is simple in theory. Layers of wood material are placed inside the press. Heat and pressure are applied. Over time, the layers are compressed into solid plywood boards at a specific thickness, 3/4 inch, ½ inch, whatever the order calls for. When it's running normally, no one goes inside, ever. But the press needs to be cleaned. Bits of wood, glue residue, debris. Over time, it builds up. If it's not removed, it affects the quality of the plywood and can damage the equipment. Cleaning it means stopping the press completely and having a worker physically enter the machine to clear everything out by hand. That's where lockout procedures come in. When a machine like that is shut down for maintenance or cleaning, it's supposed to be locked out. Physically. A lock on the switch. A tag with a name. A clear signal that someone is inside and that the machine must not, under any circumstances, be activated. In this case, it wasn't locked out. No one knows exactly why. Maybe someone was in a hurry. Maybe they thought it would only take a minute. Maybe they assumed everyone knew what was happening. Those small assumptions are how people get hurt or killed. The supervisor told us that the worker entered the press to clean it out. He was inside the machine, doing what he'd probably done dozens of times before. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the mill, someone triggered the switch. The press activated. The terrifying part wasn't that it happened fast, it didn't. That machine doesn't slam shut like a trap. It moves slowly, steadily, applying pressure over time. That meant the guy inside was definitely there while it was running. That detail hit all of us hard. There was no sudden, painless moment. There was time, awareness, realization. The press was set to compress material down to 3/4 of an inch. That number alone made my stomach turn when I heard it. 3/4 of an inch. That's the final thickness of plywood. That's not a gap a human body can survive in. The supervisor didn't go into graphic detail. He didn't need to. The silence after he said that was enough. Everyone there understood exactly what that meant. Understood how helpless that worker must have been. How completely preventable it all was. All because a switch wasn't locked. I remember standing there, staring at the concrete floor, feeling cold even though the mill was warm. The noise of the machines around us suddenly felt louder, harsher. Every forklift beep, every conveyor belt hum sounded more threatening. What stuck with me wasn't just the accident itself. It was how ordinary the situation was before it happened. Cleaning debris, a routine task, something that probably didn't even feel dangerous anymore to the people involved. That's the real horror of industrial accidents. They don't usually come from dramatic failures. They come from normal days, normal work, and one small lapse. After that talk, I couldn't look at the plywood press the same way. Every time I walked past it, I imagined the inside, the space where someone had been standing, the switch that should have been locked, the silence before everything went wrong. I started noticing how often safety rules were treated like suggestions instead of absolutes. How often people said things like, "It'll only take a second," or "I've done this 100 times." How often low pay made people rush, skip steps, or accept risks they shouldn't have. That was another part the supervisor didn't need to say out loud. Lumber work is dangerous and it doesn't pay well enough to justify the risk. People push themselves because they have bills to pay, because they're tired, because the job demands speed, and the machines don't care about any of that. I stayed in the industry for a while after hearing that story, but something had shifted. Every shift felt heavier. I became hyper-aware of where I stood, what machines were running, whether locks were in place. I watched hands, feet, switches. I noticed how easy it would be for something to go wrong. Eventually, I got out. Not because I couldn't do the work, but because I couldn't unlearn what I had heard. I couldn't ignore the reality of how fragile people are next to industrial equipment. How final mistakes can be. When people ask me about working in a lumber yard, I tell them the truth. It's dangerous work for very low pay. If someone is determined to be in the industry, I always say the same thing. Be a lumber broker, much more lucrative, much safer. You deal with numbers and contracts instead of presses and blades. That story still comes back to me sometimes, especially when I hear people joke about workplace safety or complain about procedures being annoying. Lock out your equipment every time. No shortcuts, no assumptions. Because once something goes wrong in a place like that, there's no undoing it. And that's a lesson I learned without ever seeing the accident myself. Just hearing about it was enough. I heard this story secondhand, but every detail came from official reports and from the girl herself after she returned home. It's one of those stories that sounds exaggerated until you realize there's nothing supernatural about it at all. No ghosts, no imagination, just a real person, real choices, and a very thin line between survival and something much worse. She was studying abroad in Russia, living there temporarily as part of a university program. It was supposed to be exciting, a new country, new culture, new experiences. She had been there for about a month and had settled into a routine. Classes during the day, exploring the city when she could, and like a lot of people her age, she used Tinder to meet locals and practice the language. Most of the conversations went nowhere. Some were awkward, some were boring. A few were fun but didn't lead to anything. Then, toward the end of her stay, she matched with a guy who felt different. He was charming, polite, intelligent. He spoke well, listened carefully, and didn't rush things. They talked for a while before meeting, and when they finally did, the chemistry felt real. Not forced, not intense in a scary way, just easy. They went on 6 dates over the course of a short time. 6. Each one was better than the last. Dinner dates, walks through the city, long conversations about life, culture, and future plans. He never pressured her, never crossed a line. If anything, he seemed respectful to the point that it felt refreshing. The final date was the night before she was supposed to fly back to America. They both knew it was the last time they'd see each other. There was a bittersweet feeling to it. They went out to eat, talked for hours, laughed, reminisced about their short time together. Eventually, he invited her back to his place. She hesitated. She didn't intend to sleep with him. She didn't plan on staying the night, but she trusted him. He had given her no reason not to. She agreed with the clear intention that she would leave afterward. His apartment seemed normal, clean, quiet, nothing out of place. They talked a bit more, and when she said she should probably go soon, he asked if he could give her a back massage. He said she looked tense, that she must be stressed about traveling the next day. She agreed, but she was very clear. She told him she would leave after. He told her that was fine. He had her lie down on the bed and pulled out a bottle of lotion. He started massaging her back. At first, it felt normal, a little awkward, but not alarming. The lotion was cold when it touched her skin, but that didn't seem unusual. When he finished, she sat up and said she really needed to go. That's when everything changed. His demeanor shifted instantly. His voice hardened. He started telling her she had to stay, that she couldn't leave, that it was too late. He stepped closer, blocking her path. She laughed nervously at first, thinking maybe he was joking. He wasn't. He started getting angry. His face changed. His tone became sharp, almost panicked. He kept repeating that she couldn't go, that she had to stay with him. The air in the room felt tight, suffocating. Something in her snapped into survival mode. She didn't argue, she didn't explain, she didn't try to reason with him. She just ran. She grabbed her things and bolted out the door, down the stairs, and out into the street. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she reached her own apartment. She locked the door behind her and stood there shaking, listening for footsteps that never came. She didn't sleep well that night, but she was safe, or so she thought. The next morning she woke up in pain. Her back felt like it was on fire. When she looked in the mirror, she saw an angry red rash spreading across the area where he had massaged her. It wasn't just irritated skin, it looked inflamed, swollen, wrong. The pain kept getting worse. She went to the emergency room. The doctor examined her back carefully. His expression changed as he looked closer. He asked her a few questions, then excused himself from the room. She sat there alone for a long time, wrapped in a thin hospital gown, growing more anxious by the minute. Eventually, police officers came into the room. They asked her where she had been recently, who she had met, what she had done over the past few days. She told them everything: the dates, the apartment, the massage, the argument, her escape. The officers left. They came back later with the doctor. That's when she learned the truth. The lotion he had used on her back wasn't lotion at all. It was meat tenderizer, a chemical substance designed to break down muscle tissue. The doctor explained that the rash wasn't an allergic reaction. Her skin and underlying tissue had begun to break down. Slowly, painfully. If it had been left on longer, if she hadn't escaped when she did, the damage would have been far worse. That's why the police were involved. As soon as they realized what had been used on her, they suspected intentional harm. They went to the man's apartment while she was still in the hospital. They arrested him. When they searched his freezer, they found it full of human meat, not animal meat, not something that could be explained away. Human remains. He hadn't just wanted to hurt her, he wanted to eat her. The massage wasn't intimacy, it wasn't affection, it was preparation. If she had stayed longer, if she had fallen asleep, if she had ignored that feeling that told her to run, she wouldn't have made it home. She wouldn't have woken up with a rash. She wouldn't have gone to the ER, she would have disappeared. The most terrifying part of the story isn't the freezer. It's not even the meat tenderizer. It's how normal everything was before that moment. 6 good dates, laughter, trust. No red flags big enough to stop her from going to his apartment. No obvious danger until it was almost too late. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't act like one at first. And that's what makes this story hard to forget. Because sometimes the scariest people are the ones who wait patiently, who blend in, who know exactly how to seem safe until the moment you're alone with them. She survived because she listened to her instincts, and she left just in time. I only heard about Mike the Headless Chicken recently, and I wish I hadn't. Not because the story isn't real or interesting, but because once you know it, it doesn't leave you. It sits in the back of your mind, uncomfortable and heavy, and no amount of logic really makes it easier to accept. At first, it sounds like a joke, one of those strange internet facts that gets exaggerated over time until it barely resembles the truth. A headless chicken that lived for more than a year. It sounds impossible. It sounds like something people repeat without checking, the kind of story that falls apart the moment you look too closely. But this one doesn't. Mike was real. He was a chicken that was partially beheaded. Most of his head was gone. The beak, the tongue, the eyes, the parts you instinctively associate with life and awareness were removed. What remained was a small portion of the brain and a single vein that hadn't been severed. That one detail changed everything. Because of it, Mike didn't die the way he should have. Instead, he lived. The human brain likes clean categories, alive or dead, conscious or unconscious, suffering or at peace. Mike didn't fit neatly into any of those. He existed in a strange in-between state that feels wrong the more you think about it. His owners didn't expect him to survive. No one would. But when he didn't die, they adapted. They fed him using a pipette, carefully delivering food and water directly into what remained of his throat. They had to clean his airway regularly with a syringe so he wouldn't suffocate. This wasn't a one-time effort. This was daily care. For months, then a year, then more. Mike lived for about 18 months after most of his head was cut off. That number alone is disturbing. Not days, not weeks, a year and a half. He showed behaviors that looked familiar, movements that reminded people of a normal chicken. He would attempt to peck, attempt to make sounds. His body followed instincts that no longer had the proper tools to express themselves. There was no beak to open, no tongue to move, no eyes to guide him, no ears to hear anything around him. And that's where the story becomes truly unsettling, because the question isn't just how he lived, it's what he experienced. People like to reassure themselves by saying that maybe he didn't feel pain. Maybe the part of the brain responsible for suffering was gone. Maybe he was just an empty body running on reflexes. That idea is comforting. It lets you put distance between yourself and what actually happened, but there's no real way to know. Mike still reacted to his environment. He still moved with purpose, not random spasms, but coordinated actions. His body wasn't just twitching, it was trying to do things it no longer could. That suggests some level of awareness, even if it was limited or distorted. Imagine what that existence might have been like. No sight, no sound, no ability to vocalize distress, no way to understand why the world suddenly went dark and silent. Just hunger, movement, and instincts firing into a void. The photos make it worse. If I hadn't seen them, I probably wouldn't fully believe the story. Even knowing it's documented, even knowing it's been verified, the idea still feels unreal. Seeing the images removes any doubt, but it replaces it with something heavier, a kind of quiet horror that doesn't rely on shock, but on the sheer wrongness of it. You look at Mike and your brain struggles to reconcile what you're seeing. A living animal without the features that define life as we recognize it. A body continuing forward because biology allowed it to, not because it should have. People often talk about resilience when they tell this story, about how remarkable it is that life can persist under such extreme conditions. And from a purely biological standpoint, that's true. It's a demonstration of how survival doesn't always align with dignity or comfort. But emotionally, it feels cruel. Mike didn't choose to live like that. He didn't understand what had happened to him. He didn't get a voice in whether his life should continue in that state. He was kept alive because he could be, not because it was necessarily humane to do so. That's the part I keep circling back to. His owners had to clean his throat regularly. That means that if they didn't, he would suffocate. That's exactly how he eventually died. Not from the injury itself, but because one day the cleaning didn't happen. Maybe they forgot, maybe they were tired, maybe they assumed it could wait. After 18 months of this routine, one missed moment was enough. There's something deeply unsettling about that. The idea that his survival depended entirely on constant human intervention, and that his death came not as a mercy, but as an accident. I find myself wondering what those 18 months were like from his perspective. If there was fear, confusion, pain, or if it was something stranger, something we don't have language for, an existence stripped down to impulses without context. People sometimes say animals don't suffer the way humans do, that they live in the moment, that they don't reflect or anticipate. But even if that's true, suffering doesn't require reflection. Pain doesn't require memory. Discomfort doesn't require understanding. The fact that Mike continued to attempt normal behaviors suggests that something inside him was still trying to live as if nothing was wrong, as if the world still made sense. That, to me, is heartbreaking. There's also something symbolic about the way the story is remembered. Mike became famous. He was shown to people, talked about, turned into a curiosity. His suffering, whatever form it took, became secondary to the shock value of his survival. That's not unusual. Humans have always been fascinated by anomalies. We focus on the how and ignore the should. How did he live so long? How was it possible? How did his body keep going? Those questions are easier than asking whether it was right. I keep thinking about the silence he lived in. No sound entering his world, no sound leaving it. The idea of wanting to make noise and being physically incapable of doing so is deeply disturbing. It's a kind of isolation that goes beyond loneliness. It's being cut off not just from others, but from expression itself. And the darkness, permanent darkness. No sunrise, no movement to track, no visual cues, just internal signals telling his body to act without any feedback from the world. When I think about that, it stops feeling like a strange historical anecdote and starts feeling like a quiet tragedy. The worst part is that the story doesn't end with relief. There's no clear moment where you can say, at least he didn't suffer. There's no way to know that. And pretending otherwise feels dishonest. Life doesn't always align with mercy. Sometimes survival is just survival, stripped of meaning or comfort. Mike's story forces you to confront that uncomfortable truth, that the ability to keep something alive doesn't automatically make it right to do so. That biology can continue long after compassion should intervene. Even now, after reading about it, after seeing the photos, part of my mind still refuses to fully accept it. It feels like something that shouldn't be possible, something that breaks the rules we rely on to make sense of the world. And yet, it happened. That's what stays with me, not the shock, not the novelty, but the quiet, lingering question of what it meant to be alive in that state. I hope genuinely that Mike didn't feel pain the way we imagine it. I hope whatever awareness remained was minimal, fragmented, or absent altogether. But hope isn't certainty, and the fact that we can't know makes the story heavier, not lighter. Some stories scare you because they involve monsters or violence or sudden danger. This one scares me because it's real and because it shows how thin the line is between life and suffering when survival becomes the only goal. Even now, I wish I didn't know it, but I do, and it's hard to forget. We like to think that justice is a universal law. We are taught from a young age that if you do good things will happen to you, and if you do something truly evil, you will be punished. We believe in karma, in the legal system, and in the basic idea that monsters get locked away so they can never hurt anyone again. But sometimes the real world tells a different story. Sometimes the monsters win. They commit acts that are so depraved they make you question the very nature of humanity, and then they walk away. This story is one of those cases. It is widely considered one of the most horrific crimes in the history of Japan, a country known for its low crime rate and safety. It is the story of a girl named Junko Furuta, and the 44 days of hell she endured because she made the simple mistake of saying no. To understand the tragedy, you have to picture Junko. In 1988, she was 17 years old. She was the definition of a good kid. She was beautiful, popular, and incredibly hard-working. She had a bright future ahead of her. She didn't stay out late. She didn't hang around with the wrong crowd. And she had a part-time job to save money for her future. She was the kind of daughter every parent dreams of having. She lived in Misato, a quiet area in the Saitama prefecture of Japan. It was the kind of place where people felt safe walking home after school. But in the shadows of this peaceful life, a predator was watching her. His name was Hiroshi. He was also a teenager, but he lived in a very different world than Junko. He was involved with the Yakuza, the Japanese organized crime syndicates. He wasn't a high-ranking boss, but he was a low-level thug who thrived on intimidation and violence. He was used to getting what he wanted. He saw people as objects to be used, not human beings to be respected. He had developed a crush on Junko, or rather an obsession. He approached her and asked her to date him. It was a simple interaction. Most teenage boys deal with rejection by feeling sad or embarrassed. But when Junko politely declined his advances, Hiroshi didn't feel sadness. He felt rage. To him, her refusal wasn't a choice. It was an insult to his ego. He decided that if he couldn't have her willingly, he would take her by force and break her. On the evening of November 25, 1988, Junko was riding her bicycle home from her part-time job. It was dark. The air was crisp, and she was likely thinking about school or her plans for the weekend. She had no idea that she was riding into a trap. Hiroshi and his friends were waiting for her. One of the boys kicked her off her bicycle. It was a violent, jarring fall. Junko was on the ground, confused and hurt. That was when Hiroshi stepped in, playing the role of the hero. He pretended to be a concerned passerby. He offered to help her home. It was a classic manipulation tactic, disorienting the victim and then offering a false sense of safety. But the moment she let her guard down, the trap snapped shut. They forced her into a nearby warehouse, and from there, they took her to a house in the Adachi district of Tokyo. This house would become her prison and her torture chamber for the next 44 days. The house belonged to the parents of one of the boys, a teenager often referred to as Nobu. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. This wasn't a hidden dungeon in the middle of the woods. This was a 2-story residential home in a crowded neighborhood. The boy's parents lived downstairs. They were home for much of the time Junko was held captive upstairs. You might ask, why didn't they call the police? Why didn't they stop it? The answer is a terrifying mix of fear and apathy. They knew a girl was up there. They likely heard things. But they were terrified of Hiroshi and his Yakuza connections. They were afraid of their own son. They chose to turn up the volume on the television to drown out the noise rather than save a human life. Their silence made them accomplices to a nightmare. For 44 days, Junko Furuta was subjected to things that are difficult to even speak about. The group of boys, all teenagers aged between 16 and 18, treated her with a cruelty that defies explanation. They didn't just hurt her, they seemed to enjoy the process of deconstructing a human being. They beat her constantly, they raped her hundreds of times. They used foreign objects, fireworks, and lighter fluid. They burned her skin with cigarettes and lighters. They forced her to do humiliating things, laughing at her pain. They didn't see a girl, they saw a toy that they could break over and over again. Junko was strong. In the beginning, she tried to escape. She tried to plead with them. But every attempt was met with more severe punishment. At one point, they forced her to call her parents. Imagine the psychological torture of that moment. She had to hold the phone, hearing her mother's worried voice on the other end, and tell her that she had run away voluntarily and that she was safe. She had to lie to the people she loved most, knowing that she might never see them again. The boys stood over her, threatening to kill her family if she hinted at the truth. That call was likely the moment her hope began to fracture. She realized that nobody was coming to save her because nobody knew she was in danger. As the weeks dragged on, Junko's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her body was failing, she was starving, dehydrated, and covered in severe burns and wounds that were becoming infected. She could barely move. She could barely speak. Yet the boys showed no mercy. If anything, Her weakness seemed to annoy them. They were bored teenagers looking for stimulation, and her suffering was their entertainment. They invited friends over. Other people came to the house, saw what was happening, and did nothing. Some even joined in. It was a localized infection of pure evil, spreading to everyone who entered that room. The end came on January 4th, 1989. By this point, Junko was barely holding on to life. The boys were playing a game of mahjong downstairs. They had lost a game and were in a bad mood. They decided to take their frustration out on Junko one last time. They went upstairs and beat her with iron barbells. They poured lighter fluid on her legs and set them on fire. The violence was frenzied and chaotic. After hours of this final assault, Junko's body finally gave out. She went into shock and passed away. She was alone, far from home, surrounded by the people who had stolen everything from her. The boys didn't feel remorse when they realized she was dead. They felt inconvenience. They had a body to get rid of. They treated her death with the same callousness they had treated her life. They wrapped her body in blankets and stuffed her into a 55-gallon oil drum. To make sure she would never be found, they filled the drum with wet concrete. They loaded the heavy drum into a van and drove to a reclaimed land area in Koto, Tokyo, dumping it in a desolate spot filled with construction waste. They went back to their lives as if nothing had happened. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought Junko Furuta would just be another missing person case, a girl who ran away and never came back. But the truth has a way of surfacing. The police were already investigating the boys for other crimes. They were known delinquents. During an interrogation regarding a separate assault, one of the boys cracked. He mentioned the murder. He mentioned the girl in the concrete drum. The police were horrified. They went to the location he described and found the drum. When they broke it open, the condition of Junko's body told the story of her suffering better than any witness could. The autopsy revealed the extent of the torture, leaving even seasoned detectives shaken and sickened. The arrest of the 4 main perpetrators should have been the moment of justice. The public was outraged. The media coverage was intense. Japan was in shock. How could high school students do this? How could they be capable of such sustained, sadistic violence? The country cried out for the death penalty. They wanted these monsters to pay with their lives. But then, the legal system stepped in with a cold, hard reality. Because the killers were under the age of 20, they were considered juveniles under Japanese law. The law is designed to protect children, to give them a chance at rehabilitation. It operates on the belief that young people can change, that their brains aren't fully formed, and that they shouldn't be judged as harshly as adults. In most cases, this makes sense. But in the case of the concrete-encased high school girl murder case, it felt like a slap in the face to the victim's family. The defense argued that they were just kids who got carried away, that they didn't mean to kill her. The sentences handed down were devastatingly light. The leader, Hiroshi, was sentenced to 20 years. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, though some were later increased slightly upon appeal. But none of them received the death penalty. None of them received life in prison without parole. They were given an expiration date on their punishment. The court essentially decided that a few years in prison was an equal trade for the 44 days of torture and the murder of an innocent 17-year-old girl. This is where the story shifts from tragic to terrifying. Today, all of those men are free. They served their time. They walked out of prison gates, breathed fresh air, and returned to society. They are now middle-aged men. They have had decades to live their lives. They might have gotten married. They might have children of their own. They walk the streets of Japan, perhaps shopping at the same grocery stores as you, or sitting next to you on the train. There have been reports over the years about their whereabouts. Some of them changed their names to hide their past. Some were rumored to have returned to a life of crime, getting arrested for minor offenses, proving that the rehabilitation the court hoped for was a fantasy. One of them was even reported to have boasted about his involvement in the crime, wearing it like a badge of honor in the criminal underworld. They didn't learn a lesson. They didn't feel the weight of their sins. They just learned how to manipulate the system. The injustice is a heavy burden for Junko's family. Her parents lost their daughter in the most painful way imaginable, and then they had to watch her killers walk free while they were still grieving. They have to live every day knowing that the men who destroyed their lives are out there, enjoying the simple pleasures of eating a meal, watching a movie, or looking at the sun, pleasures they denied Junko. This story is scary not because of ghosts or supernatural demons. It is scary because it exposes a flaw in our world. We want to believe that the worst crimes get the worst punishments. We want to believe that the law protects the innocent. But Junko Furuta's story proves that sometimes the law protects the monsters. It proves that you can torture a girl for 44 days, kill her, encase her in concrete, and still have a second chance at life. It makes you look at the teenagers hanging out on the street corner differently. It makes you look at your neighbors differently. It reminds you that evil doesn't always look like a villain from a movie. Sometimes evil looks like a group of bored high school boys. And the most terrifying part isn't what they did. It's that they got away with it. They are out there right now. And Junko is still gone. That is the true horror of the concrete murder case. It is a wound that never closes, a scream that never stops echoing. I still remember the first time I heard this story. It wasn't told dramatically. There was no build-up, no attempt to make it sound scarier than it was. That almost made it worse. It was told the way people talk about things that are too painful to dress up with emotion, things that still hurt even decades later. It was my mother-in-law's brother, a normal man, in his 30s, a husband, a father, someone who went to work, came home, fixed things around the house, and loved his family. Nothing about him stood out as tragic or unusual. That's part of what makes this story so horrifying. It could have been anyone. It happened on an ordinary day. He was working on his car in the garage, the way so many people do. No rush, no danger that anyone could see coming. He had the car lifted so he could get underneath it, repairing something mechanical, probably thinking about nothing more than finishing up and going back inside. His son was there too. The boy was 3 years old. 3, old enough to walk around on his own, old enough to be curious, old enough to touch things without understanding what they do, too young to understand consequences, danger, or the idea that a single small action could change everything forever. The father didn't send him away. Why would he? It was his garage, his child, his home. Parents do things like this all the time. Kids wander in and out while adults work. It's normal. It feels safe. That's what makes it so devastating. While his father was underneath the car, the boy wandered around the garage. He saw switches, buttons, levers, things that looked interesting to a 3-year-old. A garage isn't a dangerous place. It's a room full of objects waiting to be explored. At some point, the boy touched a switch. He didn't know what it was for. He didn't intend to hurt anyone. He didn't even understand that it controlled anything important. To him, it was just another thing to flip, another action to try. The switch controlled the lift. The entire car came down. There was no time to react, no time to shout, no time for the father to crawl out or protect himself. The weight of the car crushed him instantly. He died right there in the garage, under the same car he had probably worked on dozens of times before without incident. Immediate, final. One small movement of a child's hand, and a life was gone. The son survived physically, but that doesn't mean he wasn't destroyed by it. Even though he was only 3, the weight of that event followed him for the rest of his life. You don't have to remember something clearly for it to shape you. Trauma doesn't need detailed memory to leave scars. Imagine growing up knowing that your father died because of something you did. Even if everyone tells you it wasn't your fault. Even if you were too young to understand. Even if it was truly an accident, that knowledge doesn't disappear. And then there's the mother. She lost her husband in the most sudden, violent, and senseless way possible. One moment he was alive under the car. The next, he was gone. No warning, no goodbye, no chance to stop it, and the person involved was her own child. That's a level of grief most people can't even imagine. Loving your child while carrying the memory of what happened. Protecting them from guilt while dealing with your own loss. Living with a tragedy that can never be blamed on a stranger or an outside force. There's no villain in this story, just a family, a garage, a switch. When I first heard it, I felt sick. Not because it was gory or violent in a sensational way, but because of how realistic it was. How easily it could happen. How many garages exist just like that one. How many kids wander into spaces they don't understand while parents assume everything is fine. The horror comes from the randomness. There was no recklessness, no cruelty, no intent. Just a moment where safety failed and life ended. What haunts me most is imagining the seconds afterward. The silence, the confusion, the realization that something was terribly wrong. A 3-year-old wouldn't understand why their father wasn't answering, wouldn't understand why the adults suddenly screamed, wouldn't understand why the world changed forever in that moment, and the adults would understand immediately. That contrast alone is unbearable. Even now, years later, the story still feels unreal. Like something that belongs in a warning video or a nightmare, not in real life. But it happened. It really happened. And it didn't need a villain or a crime or a monster. Just gravity. When people talk about tragic accidents, they often mean something dramatic. Explosions, fires, high-speed crashes. This wasn't like that. This was quiet, domestic, ordinary. That's what makes it linger in your mind. Because it could happen in any neighborhood, any garage, any family. The lesson people usually take from stories like this is safety, childproofing, locking mechanisms, keeping kids away from machinery. All of that matters, and it's true. But even with all the precautions in the world, accidents still happen. That's the part that's hardest to accept. Sometimes tragedy isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't give you a second chance. Sometimes it comes from a place you thought was safe. I think about that boy often, even though I never met him. I wonder what it was like growing up with that shadow. I wonder how many times people reassured him that it wasn't his fault, and how many times he still wondered. And I think about the father, a man who probably never imagined that a normal day in his garage would be the last thing he ever did. A man who trusted his space, his tools, his environment. A man who died because of a simple, irreversible moment. That's what makes this story so horrifying. Not fear, not suspense, not mystery, just the realization of how fragile life really is and how quickly everything can be taken away by something as small as a child's curiosity and a single switch being flipped. It scared me when I first heard it. It still does. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. I work for a state department that investigates fire protection system accidents and failures. It's not a job people usually ask about at parties, and when they do, I normally keep the explanation short. Most people hear fire protection systems and think sprinklers going off by mistake or alarms malfunctioning. They don't imagine death. They don't imagine violence. They definitely don't imagine a concrete building collapsing because of a water tank. But in 2011, that's exactly what happened. By then, I had already seen my share of bad incidents. Failed valves, corroded pipes, systems that hadn't been inspected in years, near misses where people got lucky. You develop a certain mindset in this line of work. You learn to look at metal differently. You learn to respect pressure, age, and neglect. Water, when controlled, is harmless. When it isn't, it becomes something else entirely. The incident involved an industrial building, not new, not ancient, just old enough that things had started to be forgotten. The fire protection system in that building had not worked properly for years. That alone wasn't unusual. Systems get ignored all the time until someone is forced to deal with them. 2 workers were sent in to do an update on the water pump and complete a pressure test on a large metal holding tank. This tank was part of the building's sprinkler system. It stored water under pressure ready to feed the system if a fire ever broke out. On paper, it was a straightforward job. In reality, it was a death trap. When the workers arrived on site, they immediately noticed something off about the tank. This wasn't a small component. It was a large, heavy metal tank, the kind that commands respect just by its size. Tanks like that are designed to last, but only if they are maintained correctly. This one wasn't. They reported that the tank appeared to have been patched over time, using raw metal welded directly onto it, not professionally. Fabricated replacements, not proper reinforcement. Just metal slapped over rusted areas and holes, welded in place to stop leaks. It was the kind of fix that looks solid until you understand what pressure does to weak points. Welding patches onto a corroded pressure vessel is like putting tape over a cracked dam. It might hold for a while, but all you're really doing is hiding the problem. Pressure doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. Still, the job moved forward. The workers installed the new pump. Everything up to that point was routine. According to the reports, nothing seemed immediately catastrophic. No alarms, no sudden failures, just a system being brought back to life after years of neglect. Then came the pressure test. Pressure testing is the moment when the truth comes out. It's when a system reveals what it's been hiding. Weak spots show themselves. Small leaks become obvious. The system either proves it can handle the load or it fails. As they began filling the tank, the leaks started almost immediately. Not a drip, not a slow seep, profuse leaking, enough that the workers stopped what they were doing and called their supervisor. They were still on the phone when everything went wrong. I think about that phone call a lot. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. They saw a serious problem and reported it. They didn't panic. They didn't try to push through it. They picked up the phone. While they were explaining that the tank was leaking badly, the tank ruptured. There was no warning sound that mattered. No slow tear. No dramatic buildup. When a pressure vessel fails at that level, it doesn't explode like a bomb, but the force is just as violent. The tank tore itself apart. Metal fragments were launched in every direction, not just outward, but with enough energy to embed themselves into the concrete block building that housed the system. Concrete is not fragile. Concrete block buildings are designed to withstand impact, weather, time. This tank didn't care. The rupture was so powerful that it collapsed the building itself. Walls failed. Structure gave way. What had been a solid enclosure moments earlier became debris. The workers were hit instantly. There was no chance. No survival window, no heroic rescue attempt that could have changed the outcome. They were killed immediately by the force and the shrapnel. 2 men went to work that day expecting to update a pump and test a system. They died because a water tank failed. That's the part people struggle to understand. They hear water tank and think it sounds harmless. They don't picture force. They don't picture metal moving faster than the eye can track. They don't picture a structure collapsing inward because something designed to hold water decided it couldn't anymore. When we arrived to investigate, the scene didn't look real. The tank was no longer a tank. It was pieces, twisted metal, jagged edges, welded patches torn open, like paper. You could see exactly where the rust had been, exactly where the patches had failed, exactly how the pressure had found every weakness and exploited it all at once. The building itself looked like it had been punched from the inside. Concrete blocks were cracked and displaced. Dust coated everything. The air still felt heavy, like it remembered what had happened. There's a smell after catastrophic failures like that. Not fire, not smoke, just destruction. Metal, concrete, water, silence. The idea that this all came from a sprinkler system component was almost surreal. As we documented the failure, the story became clearer. Years of neglect, improper repairs, a system that should have been decommissioned or fully replaced instead of patched and ignored. Someone had decided that welding over rust was good enough. Someone had decided that because the system hadn't failed yet, it wouldn't. That logic killed two people. Pressure doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't care about budgets. It doesn't care about shortcuts. One of the hardest parts of this job is knowing that so many of these incidents are preventable. This wasn't a freak accident in the sense that it came out of nowhere. It was the final step in a long chain of bad decisions and ignored warnings. What stays with me isn't just the technical failure, it's the human side. Those two workers trusted the system they were working on. They trusted that someone before them had done their job correctly. They trusted that when they showed up to do their work, the environment wouldn't actively kill them. They had families, they had routines, they had plans for later that day that never happened. And all of it ended because a water tank was allowed to become a bomb. After that incident, I started seeing systems differently. I stopped thinking of failures as rare events. I started seeing them as inevitabilities waiting for the right conditions. Rust plus pressure plus neglect equals violence. It's just a matter of time. I also started thinking about how many other buildings were out there with similar tanks, similar patches, similar ignored warnings, systems that hadn't worked in years but were still sitting there, quietly aging, quietly weakening. Most people walk past fire protection systems without ever thinking about them. They're invisible until they're not. When they work, no one notices. When they fail, the consequences can be catastrophic. That incident taught me that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks like a dull metal tank sitting in a concrete room. Sometimes it looks like a system that hasn't been touched in years. Sometimes it looks like, we'll fix it later. I still think about that moment when the workers were on the phone with their supervisor, doing the right thing, reporting the problem. Seconds away from walking away, maybe, or maybe not. There's no way to know. All I know is that the force unleashed in that moment didn't come from fire or chemicals or explosives. It came from water, from pressure, from neglect. And every time I walk into a pump room now, every time I see an old tank, every time I notice welded patches where they shouldn't be, I feel that same quiet tension. Because I've seen what happens when systems fail in the worst possible way. Some accidents are loud warnings. Others are silent until they kill. And that one was a reminder that even the most ordinary infrastructure can become deadly if it's ignored long enough. I'm not sure when the first story planted itself in my head, only that it's been there for as long as I can remember. I always thought it was something my mom told me when I was a kid, sometime in the late 90s. It felt like one of those stories adults share in hushed voices when they don't realize how deeply children absorb every word. The kind of story that isn't meant to scare you permanently but somehow does. In my memory, she told it like it was real. There were two men, she said, who took a young boy from a mall, not snatched violently in front of a crowd, but quietly, the way predators do when they know exactly what they're doing. The boy was separated from his parents just long enough for someone to step in and guide him away. I remember the mall being vivid in my mind when I thought about it. Bright lights, tile floors, people everywhere. That contrast made the story worse. How something so horrific could happen in a place designed to feel safe. According to the story as I remembered it, the men killed the boy. Not immediately. They took him somewhere else. Somewhere private, somewhere no one would hear him. They gutted him, removed his insides, and then did something so disturbing that even now it's hard to put into words. They sewed his skin back up, like fixing a torn jacket, like he was an object. Then they filled his body with Coke, the soda, as if that somehow made him look normal again, as if weight and shape mattered more than life. And then, in the part that always made my stomach twist the hardest, they took him back to the mall, back to the parents, like returning a lost item, like nothing had happened. I carried that story with me for years. It shaped how I saw crowded places, how I thought about malls, amusement parks, anywhere children could get lost for even a second. It felt like a warning disguised as a story, something meant to teach fear, vigilance, mistrust. I never questioned it. I never doubted it. I just assumed it was something terrible that happened somewhere, sometime, and my mom had told me about it, so I'd be careful. Years later, as an adult, the story came up again. I retold it to my mom. I remember saying it casually, like recalling something we both knew. I mentioned how horrifying it was, how it stuck with me. I expected her to nod, maybe add a detail I had forgotten, maybe say something like, "Yeah, that one was awful." Instead, she looked at me like I was speaking a different language. She told me she had never said that. At first I thought she was joking, then I thought maybe she didn't remember. Parents forget things all the time, but she was firm, confused, slightly disturbed. She swore she had never told me that story. Not once, not ever. We went back and forth. I described it in detail. The mall, the two men, the Coke, the way they brought the boy back. She listened, her expression slowly changing, and then repeated that she had never heard anything like that before, let alone told it to her child. That's when the unease really set in. If she didn't tell me, where did it come from? I was too young in the late 90s to be reading detailed crime stories online. The internet wasn't what it is now. I didn't watch horror movies like that. I couldn't remember hearing it from anyone else. Yet the memory felt old, embedded, solid, not like a dream, not like imagination. It felt like something handed to me. The scariest part wasn't the story itself anymore. It was the idea that a memory like that could exist without a clear source. That something so specific, so graphic, could take root in my mind and stay there for decades without me knowing where it came from. Whether it was something I overheard, something I misunderstood, something my brain stitched together from fragments of other things, or something else entirely. I still don't have an answer for that. And every time I think about it, I feel that same unease. Not just about what the story described, but about how fragile memory really is. How easily the mind can create something that feels completely real. That wasn't the only unsettling thing I experienced growing up. There's another story from high school that still sits heavy with me, not because it's mysterious in the same way, but because it's real, and because of the way it ended without warning. I had gone back to high school to retry and finish. My life hadn't gone the straight path most people expect. I was older than most of the students around me, 18 at the time. surrounded by kids who were still figuring themselves out. It felt strange at first being older, but I tried not to make it a big deal. That's when I met him. He was a new kid, a really nice black kid, no older than 14. Quiet, respectful, always smiling. There was something about him that stood out, not in a flashy way, but in the way he carried himself. He paid attention, he listened. He was eager in that way kids are when they're still hopeful. For some reason, he gravitated toward me. Maybe it was because I was older. Maybe it was because I didn't treat him like a child. Maybe it was just that I was chill and didn't judge him. Whatever the reason, he started sticking with me during lunch and PE. He'd ask questions, talk about random things, laugh easily. I didn't mind it at all. If anything, it felt good to know someone looked up to me. At that point in my life, I didn't feel like much of a role model. I was just trying to get through school. But to him, I was someone solid, someone safe, someone worth following around. Then one day, everything stopped. I woke up and saw something on my PC. I don't remember exactly where it came from. I don't remember opening a specific site or clicking a specific link. I just remember reading about an incident, something that had happened the day before. The words didn't fully sink in at first. I read them, but my brain refused to connect them to reality. I went to school anyway. That's when it became real. My teacher was different that day. She looked exhausted, shaken. Her eyes were red. She started class, but her voice broke. She tried to speak, but couldn't finish her sentences. Eventually, she stopped trying. She told us what had happened. The kid was gone. The same kid who had followed me around at lunch. The same kid who laughed easily. The same kid who looked up to me. He had passed away. Suddenly, tragically. I don't even remember if she gave details or if my brain blocked them out. I just remember the room going quiet. No work got done that day. She cried. Not quietly, not politely. She cried like someone who had lost something they weren't supposed to lose. A student. A child. Someone who was supposed to grow up. The rest of us sat there, stunned. I remember staring at my desk, my hands resting on the surface, feeling completely detached from my body. I kept expecting him to walk through the door late, apologizing, smiling, taking his seat. That's how school works, right? People are late. People miss days. But he didn't come. And he never did. That's the thing about death when you're young. You know about it in theory. You hear about it on the news. You see it in movies. But when it touches your real life, your routine, your hallway, your lunch table, it feels unreal. Like the world skipped a frame and never went back. What haunted me most wasn't just that he died. It was the fact that he looked up to me. I wondered what kind of impact I had on him. If I had said the right things. If I had been kind enough. If he felt safe around me. Those thoughts lingered long after the shock wore off. There was no warning. One day he was there, alive, talking about nothing important. The next day, he was a memory. A name spoken softly, a desk that stayed empty. Between that story and the one I can't even trace back to a real source, I've learned something unsettling about the way horror works in real life. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it comes as a story you don't remember learning. Sometimes it comes as a normal day that ends without someone you expected to see again. Sometimes it's not about monsters or killers or ghosts. Sometimes it's about how suddenly things can disappear and how little control we really have over what stays with us. Those two stories don't scare me in the same way. One makes me question my own mind. The other reminds me how fragile people are, and both of them in their own way never really left me. During the First World War, there was a fortress on the Eastern Front that everyone involved already knew would not survive forever. It wasn't meant to. Its purpose wasn't to stand indefinitely, or to become a symbol carved in stone. Its job was much simpler and far more desperate. It had to buy time. Behind that fort was a town filled with civilians, families, elderly people, children, people who had nothing to do with the war except that it had reached their doorstep. The Russian military knew that if the Germans broke through too quickly, there would be no time to evacuate them. So the order was given to hold the fort for as long as humanly possible, even though everyone involved understood that it would eventually fall. The soldiers stationed there weren't naive. They knew the odds. Supplies were limited, reinforcements were unlikely. The fort itself was outdated, built for a different kind of war than the one now being fought with modern artillery, machine guns, and chemical weapons. Still, they stayed. Day after day, the Germans attacked. Artillery shells slammed into the fort, tearing chunks out of its walls. Explosions shook the ground. Dust and smoke hung constantly in the air. Inside, the Russian defenders were exhausted, wounded, starving, and slowly being worn down. They fought anyway. Every hour they held meant more civilians could get farther away. Every hour mattered. Eventually, the Germans changed tactics. Instead of continuing costly assaults, they decided to end it decisively. They brought in poison gas. This was still a relatively new weapon at the time, terrifying not just because of what it did to the body, but because of how little defense there was against it. The Russians inside the fort had no gas masks, no real protection. When the gas canisters were released and the wind carried the poison over the fort, there was no doubt among the German command that the fight was over. The gas rolled in slowly, thick and choking, seeping into every crack and opening. It burned the lungs. It destroyed tissue. It didn't kill instantly. It tortured first. Inside the fort, men screamed, coughed, clawed at their throats. Their eyes burned. Their lungs filled with fluid. Some collapsed almost immediately. Others lasted longer, forcing themselves to breathe air that was actively killing them because stopping meant dying faster. Blood began to appear on lips and uniforms as their bodies broke down from the inside. Hours passed. Eventually, silence. From the German perspective, there was no reason to believe anyone inside could still be alive. An entire fort filled with unprotected soldiers had been saturated with gas. No movement, no gunfire, nothing. They assumed the defenders were all dead. So the German troops began their advance. They moved cautiously at first, stepping through the lingering haze, weapons raised but confidence growing. They expected to find corpses, rows of bodies, a fort filled with the aftermath of gas warfare. What they did not expect was movement. Out of the smoke, figures began to emerge. Not many, around 60 men. They didn't look like soldiers anymore. Their uniforms were torn and soaked dark. Blood covered their faces and chests. Many were coughing violently, choking, vomiting as they walked. Some were holding their rifles only because their bodies hadn't yet given out. Others stumbled forward with bayonets fixed, driven by something beyond survival instinct. Their lungs were destroyed, their throats burned raw. Some were literally coughing up pieces of their own insides as the damage from the gas overwhelmed their bodies. Their faces were swollen, streaked with blood and chemical burns. They should not have been able to stand, and yet they charged. They didn't shout commands. They didn't scream insults. They didn't need to. They simply came forward. To the German soldiers, what they saw didn't look human anymore. These were not men who should have been alive. They were walking corpses emerging from poison clouds, advancing despite wounds that should have made movement impossible. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. Panic spread through the German ranks. Men began to fall back, then run. Orders were lost in the chaos. Formation collapsed. Soldiers trampled over each other in their desperation to escape what looked like an army of the dead rising from the gas. Thousands fled from fewer than 100 men who were already dying. The Russians kept advancing as long as they could. They fired when able. They stabbed when close enough. They held the line not with strength, but with the last remnants of will left in bodies that were already failing. The Germans retreated far faster than anyone would have predicted, abandoning the assault entirely. The fort did not fall that day. Those 60 men did not survive much longer. The damage done by the gas was irreversible. One by one, they collapsed. Their bodies finally gave in to injuries that no amount of courage could overcome. But before they died, they accomplished something critical. They bought more time. They held the fort long enough for the evacuation behind it to be completed. Civilians escaped. The town was emptied. And before the position could be retaken, the remaining defenders were able to rig the fort with explosives. When the Germans eventually returned, there was nothing left to capture. The fort was destroyed, denied to the enemy. Later, a local newspaper would give the event a name: the Attack of the Dead Men. It wasn't meant to glorify death. It was simply the only way to describe what had happened. Men who should have been dead, who by all logic and biology were already dying, rose up one last time to fulfill their duty. What makes the story so haunting isn't just the violence or the shock value, it's the clarity of purpose. Those soldiers knew they were going to die. They had already accepted it. Their bodies were failing, their lungs dissolving, their vision fading, and they charged anyway, not to win the war, not for medals, not even for survival, but to make sure others lived. The Germans had superior numbers, superior equipment, chemical weapons, everything that should have guaranteed victory, and yet fear broke them. Not fear of death, but fear of something that refused to die when it should have. The image of those men, bloodied and choking, walking forward through poison gas, remains one of the most disturbing moments in modern warfare, not because it was strategic brilliance, but because it revealed something uncomfortable about the human spirit. Sometimes, even when the body is finished, something else keeps moving. The men of that fort were dead the moment the gas reached them. They just hadn't stopped yet, and that was enough. That was... My uncle used to tell this story the same way every time, usually late at night when the house was quiet and no one felt like interrupting him. He never raised his voice or tried to make it dramatic. That was what made it unsettling. He would just lean back, stare at nothing for a moment, and say that there are some roads in Texas you don't ever forget, no matter how many years pass. This happened when he was younger, long before GPS. Long before smartphones, back when long highway drives felt endless and lonely in a way that is hard to explain now. He had been driving down toward Laredo, Texas, late at night. It wasn't a quick trip. It was one of those drives where the road stretches straight ahead for miles, with nothing but darkness on both sides and the occasional passing truck to remind you that you're not completely alone. He said the night was quiet, almost too quiet. The radio barely picked up any stations, just static and faint music that faded in and out. He eventually turned it off because the silence felt easier than the noise. The headlights cut through the darkness in a narrow tunnel, and beyond that tunnel, everything disappeared into black nothingness. He had been driving for a long time when he noticed something ahead on the shoulder of the road. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a signpost or debris. But as he got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a person, a woman, walking slowly along the side of the highway. That alone was strange. This was not a busy road, especially not at that hour. People did not walk there, and certainly not alone, and certainly not at night. What caught his attention even more was what she was wearing. She had on a long nightgown, not a dress, not clothes you would expect someone to be wearing outside. It looked like something someone would wear to bed. She was walking with her head slightly down, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. She wasn't waving for help or trying to flag down cars. She was just walking, step after slow step, as if she had all the time in the world. My uncle said his first thought was that she must be in trouble. Maybe her car broke down. Maybe she had been in an accident. Maybe something worse. The area wasn't known for being safe at night, and seeing a woman alone like that made him uneasy, but it also made him feel responsible. He said he couldn't just drive past her and pretend he didn't see her. So he slowed down. He pulled closer to the shoulder, keeping his car moving but at a crawl. He rolled down his window just enough to speak. He called out to her, asking if she was okay, if she needed help, if something had happened. She didn't react. She didn't turn her head. She didn't stop walking. She didn't even seem to acknowledge that he was there. That made him feel uncomfortable. Most people, even if they were scared, would at least look toward a car that slowed down beside them. He matched her pace, driving slowly next to her. He tried again, louder this time, asking if she needed a ride or if he could call someone for her. He said he was already feeling a knot forming in his stomach, a sense that something wasn't right, but he still thought maybe she was in shock or injured. Then she turned. My uncle said the way she turned is burned into his memory. It wasn't slow or confused. It was sudden, sharp, like something snapping into place. She turned her head first, then her shoulders, and in the same motion she lunged toward his car. She didn't scream. She didn't say a word. She just rushed at him. He said her face didn't look normal, not angry, not scared, empty. Her eyes were wide, fixed directly on him, and her mouth was open in a way that didn't look human, like it was stretched too far. He didn't wait to understand what he was seeing. Pure instinct took over. He slammed his foot on the gas and sped away as fast as his car would go. He didn't look in the mirror at first. He was afraid of what he might see. His heart was pounding so hard that he could feel it in his throat, and his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. After a few seconds, once he had put some distance between himself and whatever that was, he slowed down just enough to look in the rearview mirror. There was no one there. The shoulder of the road was empty. The stretch of highway behind him looked exactly the same as it had before. No woman, no movement, nothing. He said that's when the fear really set in. If she had been a real person, even if she had tried to attack him, she couldn't have just vanished like that. There was nowhere for her to go. No trees close enough to hide behind. No buildings, no side roads. Just open land and darkness. He pulled over a little farther down the road, trying to catch his breath and make sense of what had just happened. He stayed inside the car with the doors locked, the engine still running. He scanned the road, the mirrors, the sides of the highway, expecting to see her again. She never appeared. Eventually, he drove the rest of the way without stopping again. He said he didn't feel safe pulling over for the rest of the night. Every shadow on the side of the road made his stomach tighten. Every reflective sign looked like a figure standing just out of reach of the headlights. When he finally reached his destination, he didn't tell anyone what happened right away. He thought maybe he was just tired. Maybe his eyes had played tricks on him. Maybe fear had filled in the blanks and made it seem worse than it was. But the image of her turning and lunging stayed with him. Years later, he heard rumors, stories from other people who had driven that same stretch of highway. They talked about a woman in a nightgown, walking alone at night. Some said she looked lost. Some said she disappeared when cars got too close. Some said she would run toward vehicles only to vanish seconds later. There was never a clear explanation. No confirmed accident, no missing person report that matched her description. Just scattered stories, all slightly different, but all centered around the same image. A woman walking along the highway near Laredo, dressed for bed, appearing out of nowhere and leaving nothing behind. My uncle never claimed to know what she was. He didn't say she was a ghost or a spirit or anything supernatural. He just said that whatever he saw that night was not something he could explain. He said that road felt wrong afterward, like it carried something with it, something that stayed long after the headlights passed. Even now, when he talks about it, he avoids driving at night if he can. And if he ever sees someone walking alone on a highway after dark, he doesn't slow down anymore. He just keeps driving. I still remember early 2017 very clearly, even though at the time nothing felt unusual about it. Life was busy, but in a good way. I was working constantly, building my own business ventures, and finally seeing the results of years of effort. I wasn't rich, but I was doing well enough that my life looked different than it used to. Better tools, better equipment, nicer electronics, things that mattered to me because I earned them. I lived in a quiet area, the kind of place where days blended together and nights felt calm. Most evenings were the same. I'd get home tired, unwind, maybe have a beer, put something on TV, and just enjoy being in my own space. My house felt like a safe zone. It never crossed my mind that it could be anything else. That's when Matthew started coming around again. Matthew was someone I went to high school with. We weren't best friends, but we knew each other well enough. Same school, same town, same general circle. After graduation, we lost touch like most people do. There was no bad blood, just distance. So when he showed up again in early 2017, I didn't question it much. At first, it felt normal, familiar, like reconnecting with a piece of the past. He'd stop by my place, sometimes alone, sometimes with a couple of people I knew. We'd sit around, watch TV, drink beers, joke, and talk about nothing important. Everything felt routine. Looking back now, that's what scares me the most. There was no dramatic warning sign, no moment where I thought, something is wrong here. It all blended into normal life. But Matthew started coming by more often than I expected. Not every day, but enough that it became noticeable, enough that it felt sudden. One month he wasn't around at all, and the next he was stopping by regularly. He also changed from how I remembered him. He wasn't loud or energetic like he used to be in school. He was quieter, more observant. He spent a lot of time just looking around, listening more than talking. At the time, I thought he'd just matured. Then there were the questions. They were never aggressive or obvious. That's why I didn't shut them down. They were casual, almost lazy, like he was just making conversation. He'd ask things like how busy I stayed with work, what kind of projects I was running, and whether I did everything myself. He'd look at my equipment and ask what it was used for, how hard it was to get, or how much it cost. Not in a jealous way, more like curiosity. Sometimes he asked about my schedule. What time do you usually get home? Are you here most nights or out working late? Do you ever leave the place empty for a few days? I answered without thinking. I didn't feel like I had anything to hide. I was proud of what I was doing, and it felt good to talk about it. That's something I regret now. One thing that stands out in hindsight is how often he circled back to the same topics. If I mentioned being out of town once, he'd ask later how often that happened. If I said I worked alone, he'd later ask if I ever planned on bringing anyone on to help. He also asked about security. Do you have cameras? Any kind of alarm system? Anything like that? He asked it like he was just curious, like he was thinking about getting something similar for himself. I remember laughing it off and saying I probably should get something, but hadn't yet. He didn't laugh the same way. He just nodded. At the time, I didn't see the pattern. Now it feels obvious. One night in particular sticks with me. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how normal it was. It was just another night, TV on, a couple beers, same routine. Matthew was there, quiet at times, then suddenly engaged. asking questions, scanning the room like he was memorizing it. At one point he asked, "So you're usually here at night, right?" I answered without hesitation, "Yeah, unless I'm out for work." He nodded, slowly, like he was filing the information away. Later that night, he got up and said he was heading out. No tension, no argument, just a normal goodbye. I watched him walk out the door and thought nothing of it. That was the last time I ever saw him. Months went by. Life stayed busy. I didn't think about Matthew at all. He faded into the background like so many other people from the past. Then I found out the truth. I don't remember exactly how the news reached me, but I remember the moment it hit. Matthew had been arrested for a murder he was involved in back in 2016, a robbery. He and another guy targeted someone who had recently come into a decent amount of money. During the robbery, they killed him. That detail stayed stuck in my head. They chose the victim because of money. Suddenly, the timeline made my stomach drop. The murder happened in 2016. Matthew started coming around more often in early 2017. Around the same time, I was making good money and had expensive equipment sitting in my house. Everything I brushed off before came rushing back. The questions, the timing, the sudden interest. I replayed every visit in my head. Every glance he took around my place, every question about my schedule, every time he asked if I was alone or if anyone else lived with me. I don't know for sure what his intentions were. I can't prove that he was planning anything against me. But knowing what he had already done makes it impossible to believe it was innocent. That's the part that still bothers me, because if he was capable of killing someone during a robbery, then the idea that he was feeling me out isn't far-fetched. And the scariest part is how easy it would have been. He knew where I lived. He had been inside my home. He knew my routine because I told him. He knew what I owned because he saw it. And I trusted him because I recognized his face. I started thinking about the person who was killed. Someone who probably didn't think they were in danger either. Someone who likely trusted Matthew enough to let him know about their money. Someone who never thought that information would cost them their life. After that, everything changed for me. I stopped letting people drop by unannounced. I stopped talking openly about my work, my income, or my schedule. I started paying attention to the kinds of questions people asked and how often they asked them. Because what I learned from that situation is this: danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly on your couch, drinks your beer, and asks questions with a smile. The last time I saw Matthew, nothing felt wrong. That's what haunts me. How close I might have been to something irreversible without realizing it. To this day, I don't know if I was being targeted, but I know I was being watched. And sometimes, that's enough to change how you see people forever. I still remember exactly where I was living at the time, because after everything that happened, that place stopped feeling like home. It became something else entirely, something uneasy, something I could never look at the same way again. This was in southwestern Ontario, in a city with around 75,000 people. Not a massive city, not a tiny town either. Just big enough to feel busy, but small enough that people believe serious crime didn't really happen there. The kind of place where you recognize faces at the grocery store, where news spreads fast, where parents feel comfortable letting their kids walk a few streets over without worrying too much. I lived 9 houses away from someone who turned out to be a rapist and a murderer. At the time, that sentence would have sounded ridiculous to me. Impossible. That kind of thing happens somewhere else. In big cities, on the news, not on your street, not near your house, not near people you know. But it did. On New Year's Day of 2013, a young woman named Noelle Paquette was raped and murdered. Even now, writing her name still feels heavy, the kind of heavy that settles in your chest and doesn't really leave. The night it happened started like so many nights do. Ordinary, forgettable, no warning signs, no sense that something horrific was about to take place. Noelle had been at a local bar with her boyfriend. From what came out later, they got into an argument around 2:30 in the morning. It wasn't unusual. Couples argue, people drink, people leave bars upset all the time. Nothing about that moment would have stood out to anyone watching. At some point after leaving the bar, she was abducted. That part still messes with my head. The randomness of it. She didn't know them. She didn't provoke them. She didn't make a series of bad choices that night. She crossed paths with the wrong people at the worst possible moment. Two people, Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor. They forced her into a vehicle at knife point. 18 kilometers. That's how far they drove her. From a familiar part of the city all the way to the southern edge, where things thin out and the streetlights disappear. 18 kilometers is not a short drive when you're being held against your will. It's long enough to realize no one is coming. Long enough to understand you're not just being scared. Long enough for hope to drain away and be replaced by terror. They took her to a forest, a place that during the day probably looked harmless. Trees, snow, silence. But at night, especially in winter, forests feel like they swallow sound, like whatever happens inside them is meant to stay hidden. That's where they raped her. That's where they killed her. The brutality of it was hard to process when the details started coming out. It wasn't a crime of panic. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't something that spiraled out of control. It was deliberate, planned in mindset, if not inexact. Execution. What made it even worse was what investigators uncovered afterward. They were involved in fetish websites, communities where rape was not just discussed, but glorified, where violence was framed as power, where violating someone was described as exciting, empowering, even justified. Knowing that changes how you think about everything, because it means this wasn't just about opportunity, it was about desire. And then the story came closer, much closer. Tanya Bogdanovich lived 9 houses away from me. 9. I could count the distance in my head. I had walked past that house more times than I could remember. I had passed it without a second thought. I had existed in the same physical space as someone capable of something so horrific, and I never knew. What makes it worse is that I knew her son. I was close friends with him. He used to walk to my house sometimes, just show up like kids do, knock on the door, ask if I was home, sit around, play games, talk about nothing important. He was just a kid, completely separate from what his mother was hiding. But after everything came out, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that the woman who raised him, the woman whose house he walked back to, was capable of rape and murder. And then there's the moment that still feels unreal, even now. 10 days before the murder, right before Christmas break, there was a school assembly. She was there. Tanya Bogdanovich stood in my school gymnasium, surrounded by students, staff, teachers, smiling, blending in, looking like any other parent or community member. No one knew, no one suspected, no one looked at her and thought, this person will soon be involved in a violent sexual murder. That image haunts me more than almost anything else, because it proves something terrifying. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they sit in assemblies. Sometimes they smile politely. Sometimes they live 9 houses away from you. When the news broke, the city changed overnight. I remember the media frenzy. Police tape, news vans, reporters everywhere. Cameras lining streets that used to be quiet. You couldn't drive down my street without running into blockages, traffic, people slowing down just to stare. Neighbors were hysterical. Parents were terrified. People locked their doors in broad daylight. Conversations stopped being about normal things and turned into the same questions over and over. How did this happen here? How could no one know? Who else is hiding something? The sense of safety that everyone took for granted evaporated. It didn't fade slowly, it snapped. One moment the city felt normal, the next it felt exposed. I remember lying awake at night, replaying everything in my head, thinking about all the times I walked alone, all the times I passed that house, all the times her son walked to mine, all the normal moments that suddenly felt dangerous in hindsight. And the worst part was realizing how close the danger really was. Not a vague someone somewhere, not a stranger on the news, but a real address, a real house, a real person whose physical presence overlapped with my daily life. After that, I started noticing something else. Other bad stories started surfacing. Crimes, incidents, things people used to dismiss or downplay. It felt like once the illusion was broken, everything else rushed in to fill the gap, like the city had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled all the darkness at once. People started looking at each other differently. Trust became thinner. The idea that this doesn't happen here was gone forever. What stays with me the most isn't just the crime itself, as horrific as it was. It's the proximity. The fact that I was living a normal life, hanging out with friends, going to school, while something so violent was unfolding just blocks away. The fact that the people responsible didn't live on the margins of society. They lived among us. It taught me something I wish I never had to learn. Safety is often an assumption, not a guarantee. You don't always get warning signs. You don't always feel fear before something terrible happens. Sometimes the danger is already there, already woven into your environment, and you only see it once it's exposed by tragedy. I still think about Noelle Paquette, about how her night started like any other, about how unfair it all was, about how close the people responsible were to my own life. And every time I hear someone say, "Nothing like that ever happens here," I feel a chill. Because I've lived close enough to know how wrong that belief can be. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives. Because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.